This is our introductory session for a 5-part webinar training series that's going to start up in a couple of months. Barb Horn, who's the Water Quality Specialist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife and also a longtime River Network board member, she's going to be delivering this training. And today's webinar is an introduction to that series. So you'll get an idea of the type of training style that she'll have and the type of material that the training will cover. And she'll go into that in more detail as we move along. My name's Adam Griggs. I'm the Science Manager with River Network, and I'm just providing some staff support for this program. So I want to welcome everyone. You're in the right place. And if you have any trouble at all during the time, feel free to use those chat windows. Staff will be monitoring those for any problems that we might have. And we've got a little information on slide 2 we can go over. Barb, why don't you advance this one slide? There we go. So like I said, today this is an introductory webinar. It's going to touch on the content that's covered in the in-depth training series that will start in the fall. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted to the River Network website following today's webinar. We're going to try to make use of a lot of the Adobe Connect tools that are built in. A couple times we'll be asking for polls, do a quick hands up. You should be able to set your mood or raise your hand or agree yes or not agree with some controls based up in the attendee list of your window there. Maybe you want to experiment with that. But hopefully we're looking for some participation because the more information we get out of you guys during the call, the more we can customize the presentation to suit your needs. Hopefully all of you got the handouts and were able to either print those out or have them open on your computer. This will be a hands-on exercise today, and immediately following, we will post the webinar evaluation, always looking to get good feedback on our webinars so we can make sure that they're doing the job we designed them to. So the link is there. If you want to hold on to that link, it'll also come up again towards the end. So without further ado, let me introduce your presenter. Her name is Barb Horn, Water Quality Specialist for Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife. So take it away, Barb.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thanks, and it's a real treat to be doing this. And it does drive me crazy to not see all the great, good-looking people who are doing monitoring out there. I love in-person classes. This is the next best thing, so welcome, everybody. And if you have any questions at any time or you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to type that in. And Ryan, who's working behind the scenes, is there to help, and Adam's there to help, too. So. Thanks again, Adam. I've been teaching this class to some degree for about 10 to 12 years, and my background is I am a water quality specialist with Parks and Wildlife. But I started a volunteer monitoring program 20-some years ago here in response to having no data in Colorado. And over the course of those years, getting connected to the national movement of citizen science or volunteer monitoring, I've learned a lot, and at some point, Jeff Dates and I, who used to be staff at River Network, created some materials in a workbook trying to address the problems we found around the nation of why groups were not getting their data used, why they weren't able to show what they had done and get funding or get on-the-ground changes in policy or restoration or whatever it is they were doing. And we created this workbook that you will fully engage in and go through in the fall class in trying to address that gap between when we go out and monitor and play in our rivers and waters, how do we make that turn into something measurable that increases our funding, increases our effectiveness, and maybe on the real big dream scale actually makes us so successful as organizations we go away. You're looking here at a picture of Ouray, Colorado, which is a beautiful little town just north of where I live. And for those of you that recently heard all the commotion and chaos around the Animas River, if you drove south from this town over 3 mountain passes, you would be in Silverton, Colorado, where the headwaters of that recent sort of disaster occurred. The short on that is things are going well. It's been a big wake-up call, but it's never good to learn by disaster. Anyway, what I'd like you to do in the next second is there's a fair amount of you, but if you would be willing to, for the next few minutes, just type in your expectations for this webinar today. And if you see somebody type in an expectation that matches yours, you don't need to type it in again, but we just want to get a sense of what you'd like to get out of this particular webinar, because you will walk home with some ideas. And maybe you don't need the full-on fall course, or maybe you'll really get to an understanding that you might need some of the things that you can get out of the fall course. So thanks, Heather, for already typing in. Go ahead and type in some expectations here. We'll let them come in. Thanks, Bob. So one expectation is to organizing principles for a new water quality monitoring program. That is so great, Heather, because it's great to start at the beginning and not have to revamp. And some of you might have been inheriting, for example, a 30-year monitoring program, and you don't even know the original reasons it was created. Some of you are sitting in for other people. Some of you want to know what to do to get ready for the fall series. So those of you that are just starting a program, this is a great place to start so that you get it right for you. Helping to keep volunteers recruited, great. I'm reading some of these. Improving existing programs. There's some real specific monitoring questions, which we won't get into any specific detailed method or approach because it's so site-specific. But for those of you that have those kinds of questions, I'd be happy to chat with you offline. You all have my email address at the bottom of every page of the workbook you have. I'd be happy to try to answer some of those real specific questions, or at least give you my opinion on them. Great. Wow, great expectations. I'm just reading some of your expectations. So a lot of you are wanting your data to get used, to have it mean something, to work in partnership with, say, municipalities or non-point source or discharge programs and rules. When you're talking about making a monitoring program that generates measurable results, it is about relationships. It's about relationships with decision makers and understanding what they need to make a decision. And we're not used to measuring what we deliver to decision makers, that we even deliver anything, and then what happens with the data and the decisions. Those are some of the things we're not used to measuring in a monitoring program. So I think most of you will get something out of this, and I hope you continue the conversation, because monitoring is a really, really big topic. So thank you for taking the minute to share. Let's see. Oop, we already did that. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of kind of the framework of which we're going to talk about things today. And if you would have your workbook out, we really are going to make this a hands-on webinar the best we can. So if you can understand kind of the flow of the framework of talking about this work that we're going to use, what we usually do is we come up with a why. We want to know the answer to something. We want to influence people. We want to influence a decision, a process. That's all in the whys. That even includes, sometimes we just start with a monitoring question. And the mistake that many groups make is they actually they start with a monitoring question, and they don't sort of connect that with people, decision makers, decision processes, and information needs to really get that question not only answered, but to have action taken from answering the question. Most of us don't want to not just know what the dissolved oxygen in our river is. We may start out with that question, But once we have the data, then we want to take action on what that data is telling us. So that's what I call kind of the people. Who will do what with the data and the information we generate? And then the overall process here is then you have this question, you have this action you want to have happen, something happen, and you go out and you collect, you monitor, you design something, or you react to something, and you actually generate data. You somehow turn that into information, and then you look at that information and you assess what's the story. What's the story here? What action do we need? What do we want? Who do we need to put pressure on? That's that assessment piece. And then you might even take that information in some form and deliver it into an actual decision and outcome. And so it's along this continuum of implementation that you want to design so that at the end you actually can have these measurable results. So part of what we were designing, what we set out to do with this workbook is to change the culture of monitoring to get beyond this phenomena where we focus on the monitoring data all the time. We're bean counting. We count the number of indicators we do, the number of stations we monitor, the river miles, the surface acre, the number of lakes and reservoirs. We're bean counting what we do when we actually monitor, how many data points we generate. But that monitoring data is a means to an end all the time. And what we get lost is that end. That's what's harder to measure. That's where the measurable results are. So this whole workshop today, and a chunk of what is often missing, is how do we not get stuck in these bean counting things? And they're important. Don't get me wrong, they're important to track, but you don't want them to be the means to the end. You want the end. That's what we want to be measuring. So what we're going to do today in this webinar here is I'm going to try to portray and have you understand this continuum of why we do, really getting into why we do what we do, and see how that drives what you actually do, what you actually monitor, where you monitor it, when you monitor it, the level of precision that's needed, how do you turn all of that into information, then how do you evaluate what you just did. If you put all of those together, all of those pieces in flow, what you're really creating is an information system. You don't have a monitoring program. What you have is an information program. So that's kind of helping you understand that and broadening your perspective is one objective we have today. Another objective we have is having you have an experience with identifying what your information needs are, and what does that really mean when I say that? How do you find your target decision makers and decide that that's who you really want to target? I've had people go through this training and they realize they've been barking up the wrong tree, if you will. And how do you connect your monitoring to these decisions and actions and measure that? And then hopefully from just sort of touching on this work and having a little experience with your own program, you can identify why you, if you have an existing program, why you may not be creating measurable results, and possibly where to look in order to fix that. And if you're just starting, you can start out right away with a plan that would create measurable results. So that's the objectives today. Hopefully you'll find something in there. So now we want to do a little poll so I get a sense of the community out there and how many of you are actually, where you might be stuck. So I'm going to ask these 4 questions, and we're going to do 4 different hand-raising polls. And again, your raising hand thing is up there by your attendee list. And I want you to raise your hand if you do not have, if you're stuck in one of these areas. And I'll read them. We'll take a poll. We'll clear the poll. Then I'll read the second one. So again, this is if you do not have this, if you're struggling with this piece. So if you do not know in your existing program or the one you're planning on, if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing and who you're collecting the data for, raise your hand. So again, this is if you don't know why and who you collect data for. Good. Okay, so out of 31 people, 4 of you don't know that. So you know that you need to define that before we get off this call. You've just learned something. So the next question is, if you do not know what you do, where you do it, or you don't really know, you're confused about what to do, where to do, how often to do it, what is the level of precision and QA, quality assurance do I need to have, or if you do not know really how to manage your raw data, or you're not managing your raw data well, raise your hand on that one. So that's about a third of the group. And typically that one does raise more hands. And sometimes the meat of that one is that data management. A lot of programs, data management is an afterthought, kind of like adding the bedroom onto the back of the house. So this workbook in this process actually has you create a data management plan. It's one of the sub-products of following the entire workbook. We'll touch on it today. I'll give you a few little hints on that aspect. So Adam, can you clear that poll out? The next question is, if you get stuck in, well, we generate all these numbers, we do this, we've had this program for a long time, or we're going to plan to generate a lot of data, but we don't really have a plan on how to translate that into information and deliver it. That's things like analysis, interpreting, reporting, actually delivering raw data or information to a targeted decision maker. If you are stuck there and you don't know how to do that, raise your hand. Great. Okay, so that's about half the people. And this is another weak point, too, in a lot of programs, because if you're not doing that, if you don't have a plan to do that and you don't implement that, then you don't have really anything to measure but the beans, but the W's, what you're doing, when, where, and how. And so we'll touch on this today, but the class in the fall here will actually have you design a plan on how to do that. And then when Adam clears that poll out, the last question is, how many of you actually do not ever, have never evaluated a program? Or if you're starting a new program, you maybe haven't even thought about, gee, how will I evaluate this? It's so exciting to start a program that we kind of get lost in maybe when might we stop and check in and evaluate what we're doing. All right, so that's about a little less than a third of you guys. So great. In that evaluation phase or step is actually where you answer questions. Like, we all have these monitoring questions, but how many of your programs actually take the time to say, here's the answer to that monitoring question? We asked, is the DO changing in our river, but we never actually stopped and answered that. So we'll talk about that a little bit in this framework. Great, so that helps me know a little bit where you're at, and if nothing else, you just got some information on where you might be stuck in measuring results for your program. All right. So this particular slide I have up is on page 2 of your workbook, so you can see it hands-on there. And again, putting what we've been talking about, this whole process, into sort of a linear plan, what I call the people design, again, is the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? What questions are we asking? Who are we asking to do something different? That's the people design. That's where you define your information needs. And those information needs they absolutely drive what you do, when you do it, where you do it, how you do it, the data that you generate, what I call the technical design. The whys absolutely drive the use of the data. How do you turn that into information? How do you analyze it? How do you report it? What format? When do you report it? And then finally, when and where and who and how you evaluate it. So this sort of data pathway is the data pathway to your ability to communicate and measure what you're generating. And we call this data pathway like when you collect that first piece of data or information, you're birthing that information. What is the pathway to get that information all the way to a change, to a question you've answered, to a decision process? That's exactly what you're trying to measure. And in designing your monitoring system, you want to design this pathway to generate information. And then it lends itself very easy, much easier than before, to generating measurable results. So I'm just trying to set a context of a framework here in order to talk about these things and help you find ways to get what you're missing. If you turn the page on your page 3 of your workbook, this is the framework of the actual class and the workbook that we'll be going entirely through in the fall. I have it on 2 slides here because I couldn't fit them on one, but basically phase 1 there, each one of those steps in the workbook has a series of worksheets that you can change. They're in a Word document to fit you that cover this people design, this whole why part. And then the answers to the information generated in phase 1 dictate phase 2, which is the technical design, which is where most of us are comfortable. If we're not comfortable, it's the easiest place to get help in these what, when, where, hows pieces. And then, again, the whys in phase 1 determine how we summarize and analyze data, how we interpret conclusions we might make, recommendations we might make, how we communicate what we find and how we deliver it. And then there's a whole aspect of managing data for information. Managing your data for information generation is very different than managing the raw data. It's a very different process. It requires different software, for example. Where you store your raw data, for example, is different than the statistical package or the analytical Excel things that you do. You want to make sure there's integrity that can flow quality data without ruining your raw data into that information management. And then finally, phase 4 is this evaluation. Who does what? How are some of you might be in a monitoring program? I mean, this framework works for even state agencies where there's a laboratory unit division, and then there's the assessment division, and then there's the people who do something with the data. If you're big enough and you're that separated, you need a who will do what even more so that those sections are talking to each other, because a monitoring and assessment implementation effort occurs over time, years even. And so this monitoring plan is what you start with, but it's very iterative over a long period of time, so you can really lose communication across the different elements of a monitoring plan for measurable results. All right, so that is the framework we're going to be going over. Today we're going to do some exercises specifically. This little workbook you have here pulls out some specific worksheets on these particular steps. How we connect our data objectives, our monitoring objectives, to our decision makers and generating information needs and putting that all together, because that's the piece that people miss. It's the piece that we don't learn about when we're learning all these sampling techniques, or even learning things like Excel and data management. It's the piece that nobody really teaches in my mind. Even the National Water Quality Monitoring Council's monitoring wheel starts with the monitoring objective. It starts with the science question. It doesn't start with the people question. So we're going to spend some time on this exercise today and do a little bit of how that, showing you how when you do that, down here in your evaluation of effectiveness, which is a version of a measurable result, how they relate to each other. So let's see. Catching up with my own notes here. So the amount of time and rigor that you might spend on each one of these steps is really a function of you and your program. I present this in a linear way because we need a way to talk about it. But when you make a plan like this, it isn't linear at all, and that's one of the reasons we've designed the upcoming fall class. We've spaced it out over 5 months because when you're working with people, you might need to consult your board and your advisory committee, or maybe your constituents, or maybe you need to raise money for this and you need to get this particular stakeholder group on board. It's a very iterative process when you do a plan like this. It's a live process. And so even though I presented it linear here, I want you to understand it's iterative and it takes a little bit of time, which is why you're not going to walk away today with a plan. I would never tell somebody it wouldn't be a very meaningful plan in 90 minutes. And I want this to be meaningful for you. You may, in your program, need to only spend a very few minutes or nothing. Maybe it's all verbal, what you have for steps 1 and 4 maybe. Maybe you're the opposite. You need to document everything you do. So it's really, really program specific. And in the fall class, you're going to be able to bring your exact experience to the table and spend the amount of rigor that you need on each of these, whether that's a lot of time or a little time. This particular framework works for all media types. I just want to mention that. We talk a lot, there's a lot of examples in the workbook on surface water, but it works for macroinvertebrates, biology, it works for vegetation, physical habitat, stream morphology. It even works, I did this training, presented this framework to a bunch of range land managers for the BLM. It's a way of thinking and a way of approaching the gathering data so that you make sure that data has an endpoint. It has a difference. It has a targeted, measurable endpoint. So think of it that way, and maybe don't get buried into the nuances of it, because it's really a way of thinking. It's a framework, a way to think. If you do sign up for the fall course, you will get 4 entire large notebooks, all electronic, that have a series of worksheets in them that you can modify for your own purpose. What you have today for the webinar, again, is just a little sort of subset of that. All right. So I want to just take a second and step back a little bit and relate. I want you to find yourself in this process. And so this particular slide I'm showing you now isn't in your workbook. But if you look in the upper left, or in the middle actually, the comment in the middle is, how do your current conditions compare with expectations? We usually start out when we want to monitor something, we're reacting to something. Maybe a decision like this late Animus disaster in my neighborhood here, or maybe you're, whatever, you get what, you have some expectation. You want your river, your lake, your estuary to look like, behave like, be healthy. You have an expectation. And then you go out and you monitor it. That expectation might be against a reference condition. It might be against your memory. It might be against a desired condition. This doesn't have to be technical terms here. The bottom line is you have an expectation, and if you follow that down, the arrow down, you go out then, you design a monitoring plan to measure what's out there, whether that's physical, chemical, biological, or wherever you are in the environment. And then, in essence, you want that monitoring design to do this comparison between what you saw and found out there with what you expect. Then you do some sort of analysis or interpretation, and your conclusion is, well, gosh, this didn't reach my expectations, so now that's a version of impairment. And then maybe you take your effort and your data and your monitoring towards a restoration venue. Maybe you find out that this is really great, and your whole goal is to protect what's already good and not allow it to degrade. So your conclusion is, wow, this really is great stuff. It's better than I thought. I want to move my monitoring and my program down to protection. This is, in general, what most of us do in this river water community. So I hope you can find yourself in that. Another way to sort of focus more in on this impairment restore versus protect and it's high quality is this view. Again, sort of narrowing in on what a monitoring plan is doing. We start over here on the right where number 1 is, where we are asking some sort of question. That's where your monitoring question is. If that's where you're starting here today with me, you put your monitoring question there, or all of them. It may be around the ecological health. It may be around, is this plant upstream of me here doing an illicit discharge? Whatever it is, you put your question there. Then you come over here and you start a monitoring program that actually is trying to weed out maybe the difference between what is natural versus what is human. And why I put it in this context is because you want your design to have an accurate understanding over here of what is natural and what is human, because often the action we want someone to take is this decision maker. We want them to control this human factor because in theory we're humble enough to say we can't control nature. So sometimes this is the context you're in, and it really relates to what I'm trying to get at today, which is about understanding your information needs. When you have an ecological question or your monitoring questions there, you're saying I have this need for information, but that need for information is connected to what I'm going to actually do with the data or ask somebody else to do with it. If I don't incorporate that into my scientific question and into my design and my monitoring, it's going to be hard to measure results. It's going to be really hard beyond that bean counting that I shared. So I hope you can find yourself in these descriptions here. But what this does is raises a lot of questions that we as a community struggle with. And if any of you are in the business of doing restoration, you're well aware of this struggle of how do you really measure restoration, for example. So what it brings up is a lot of questions, like we say we're going to monitor, if you back up a slide here, the ecological health of my river. Well, what does that mean? What health means to me may not mean the same thing to every other 29 or 35 people on this call. What does restore mean? We have a river in Colorado that if we were to restore it back to its original state, it would be a flash flood braided ugly stream. Right now it actually is a trout stream. But in its natural state, it was not a trout stream. So you begin to have to define what is restore, what is impaired, what is natural, what is possible. But we don't typically define these terms in our monitoring programs. And when we don't define them, we have a harder time measuring. Did we get to healthy? Did we get to restore? Many, many people cringe when I get to this part of the presentation because that's really hard to define. So the invitation I give you here is that it's just the next thing. If you can define what healthy is or restore is or whatever those vague terms are back here in your question, then you have something to measure. And I guarantee you when you monitor, more questions are going to come up than you have answers for. But if you can say healthy is, maybe it's an index, an MBI index, or maybe it's dissolved oxygen is this concentration for this period of time in this season. Whatever healthy is, you want to define it. Whatever they are, you want to define it, knowing, this is the key here, knowing that based on what you find or based on any other reason you might have, you can change the definition. But if you've defined it, then you can actually tell a story. Well, we went out and we found this, and we now have adjusted our definition of healthy to mean this. And we can, here's the quantifiable and the subjective and blah, blah, blah on what healthy is. You now have a measurable story to tell in a way that you didn't before because of these elusive targets. If you look at the Clean Water Act, it took on the job of defining these things through uses and then criteria that say chemically or biologically this use is met, i.e. is healthy, is being met if this criteria is met. And they evolve that and update that all the time. So whether you're using clean water endpoints or your own endpoints, healthy might just mean I can go down and swim in that pond and I'm not getting sick. It does not need to be Clean Water Act definitions. The point here is when you sit down to do these measurable result things, you're going to have these ambiguous terms that come up, and you want to take the time to define them. You might find among your stakeholders that there's a difference in these definitions, and that clarity and that coming together is very powerful in and of itself. So why is producing measurable results so hard? I'll just take a brief moment to sort of, it's hard because some people don't know about it. They don't know how to do it. They don't know its value. They're not connecting this planning to this planning phase to the actual outcomes. A lot of times that's because so much time evolves in between when you're monitoring. You might have a 3-year, 4-year, 10-year monitoring plan, and some people forget. People change. They leave. And then there's often not a lot of time or money allowed for thinking this stuff through. So my argument to you, I've been doing this almost 30 years, is I see too many programs, and this includes government agencies, that spin their wheels down there in that phase 2 and phase 3, what they're collecting, turning it into information because they didn't spend the time thinking through or updating the whys. So I'm going to argue that if you don't spend the time on it and the money on it, you'll be spending the time and money on it just somewhere down the phase, and you just won't have it connected to a real lack of getting that information piece right. All right. So in essence, we just covered this sort of continuum of trying to explain to you there's this continuum of understanding your information needs, the why, and that drives the what and the when and the how, that you're really creating an information system versus a monitoring system. And I just want to pause for a moment and type in if you have any questions or any comments. Just pause for a quick moment on that, because now we're going to move on to an actual exercise trying to identify our information needs. I'll just pause for a moment, see if there's any questions. You can type them in or raise your hand. Okay, good. Either everyone's asleep, or they're doing their hair, or they're really, really engaged. Cool. So now I want you to turn to your page, let's see, it's page 5, and you're going to get a version of this matrix that's fuller than the one I have on the screen. We're going to move on to actually trying to get at how do we get at this information system, the information we want to list here. So we're going to go through, use a series of worksheets to fill out this matrix that you have in full on page 5 of your workbook. We're down on the left side of this are all your data uses that either you plan to use your data if you don't have a program, or if you already have a program, you have a data purpose here. And if I briefly go down them, the first one, A there, is just lost my page here, sorry, is condition and trend investigation. So you're monitoring for the purpose of understanding a condition of your body of water, or a trend analysis. Is the water quality going up or down? Is the fish population dying or coming back? It's a condition and trend investigation. The area of section B is more impact. Something happened. Whether it was a point source or a non-point source, something happened, like this Animas River situation down here in Durango. Something happened. There was a spill. There was legacy mining. There was a development went in. Sprawl has occurred. There was some event, natural. It doesn't matter. You're trying to get the impact. It could be a recent event, a long time ago event. You're trying to assess the purpose of your data collection is to investigate an impact. The third area is effectiveness investigation, and that's a heavy term for maybe you just did a restoration. Maybe a new regulation just came online, but you're trying to monitor the effectiveness of something, an action, an act. So your purpose for monitoring is to, again, investigate the effectiveness of something. It can be a physical something, a political, a policy, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last one area is use support investigation. The purpose of your data collection is to monitor for use support. And again, this can be Clean Water Act definition, or it can be as simple as the pond my family swims in, I want to know if it's safe for them to play in it. There's that continuum of formality there, but you're really asking the question, does this body of water support the uses that it's being used for? So Jeff and I found that this A through D here, for water monitoring anyway, covered most of what everybody is doing, that everybody could find themselves in there somewhere. And many of you, in fact, I would guess more than half of you, monitor more than one. Your purpose is multi here. And it's also builds on itself. So maybe you go out and you start your program with conditioning and trend, and you find out an event happens, and now you switch to impact. You've assessed the impact of this event, and you've done restoration, and so now your monitoring has moved on to, was it effective? And all along all of that, you're watching the use. Did all of this support the use all along? You could be in all of those areas, and in my program here, we monitor for all of those areas. What I want you to get a feel for, and you probably already know this if you're doing a program, is that each one of these has a little different study design to it. Where you go, what you do, the technical piece of it, and even the information design of it is all a little bit different. So I want you to take a minute, and step one, what I'd like you to do is if you take your page 5, your whole matrix, and the steps I'm going through are on page 7 of your workbook. And if you pull out your page 8 of your workbook, and if you would put the full matrix up in front of you and then put the page 8 worksheet below it, because you're going to be filling out both of those. What I want you to do is just brainstorm either on the table on page 5 or on the first column of page 8. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just brainstorm your uses. How many of them are in A? How many of them are in B? Identify in your own language what are the purposes, either intended or existing, of the data that you're generating. And if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in there, and we'll try to answer them. So you have about 3 or 4 minutes to do this. From your own program, filling in the purposes or uses of the data, trying to relate them to the areas of A, B, C, or D. And for today, you don't need to necessarily get every single use out. If you could just work with me on some you're really connected with so we can follow it through the whole process, you can come back and totally complete this. So just getting at least 1 or 2 down on uses or purposes of your data. And feel free if you to raise your hand if you cannot come up with anything, if you don't have any use. I'll give you one more minute to get another use down, or one use at least. Oh, I'm just so hungry. I want to know what uses you guys put down, but that's the disadvantage of a webinar. So the next step, again, I'm following steps on page 7, is to fill out the second column of that worksheet. And for every single use you have, you want to write down the associated monitoring questions, your data objectives. Those are the same thing. Write down at least ones you know of, or a few. For every purpose, you ought to have one or two or more questions. And you might begin to realize that some of your uses are asking the same questions, or vice versa. They just have a little different purpose. So I'll give you a minute there to type in, to record the data objectives or the monitoring questions you have with those uses. Again, you don't need to get them all. Just get some to get a flavor for this. If you have any questions, type them in the chat box. I hope everybody's getting that, because that's usually pretty the easiest part of this is identifying the questions you're going to ask. So I'll give you a chance to raise your hand if that's confusing. Looks like everybody's getting that. We're going to go on to step 3. So for every single data use that you laid out on your worksheet, page 8, you want to list all the targeted decision makers for that data. So I need you to listen to me for a second. You'll put them in the third column there. I say list all the targeted decision makers for that data, for that purpose. So that doesn't mean everyone who could possibly influence your decision. It's who are you targeting? Who are you trying to influence? It's a very big difference here. If you're collecting data because you just want anyone to use it and you haven't identified who is going to use it, who you want to use it anyway, whether they do or not, you don't have any measurable results. So again, it's not everyone who could possibly use this. It's who you as an organization, for your mission, for your funding, for your grant, for whatever fill in the blank, are you targeting for that particular purpose. I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and you can put those down on, again, in that third column of your worksheet in page 8. And you likely have more than one user for a particular use. So I want to just interrupt you for a second because I'm going to give you a little more time. And what you're in essence doing is filling out now the top part of this matrix. And as you put down these specific users, I want you to think about whether they fit into 1, 2, or 3 on this continuum. And the context for this continuum is absolutely 100% about information needs. So you can get, I don't need to speak too much about it here, but you guys get, if you're generating data to educate fifth graders, or to educate your community, or educate a city council, or your local health department, when you're educating something, it's a very different kind of set of information that you would generate than if you're on the, if we go over here to regulatory or legal. If you are generating information to shut down the power plant upstream of you, that's a very different study design. What you do, where you do, how you do it, but it's also very different information design. And then those two are different than this sort of community or advocacy planning. This is where things like watershed management goals fit in, watershed planning, 305B reporting for this condition investigation sort of area. So if this helps you figure out who your users are, eventually you want to identify if they fit in education or community advocacy or in regulatory. And I have 2 more slides kind of on, again, who is a decision maker? A lot of groups I work with, they don't know who the decision maker is, and then they realize, well, it's us. It's our neighborhood. It's the lake, the subdivision. It's our homeowners association. It's us. What do we want to know? And it has nothing to do with what we want the health department to know. So it could be any or all of these people, and there's a big menu of particular decision makers. So with that, I'll shut up for a minute and then fill out that column. And if you want, you can begin to put your users in your chart on page 5 of your worksheet. And again, you don't need to list every single one of them, but if you can get some down. The last thing I want to say about this is the difference between the continuum of, I know we want to get our targeted decision maker is the health department or whoever does the Clean Water Act. Maybe it's the DEQ in your state. There's a difference between that, writing that down, and writing down, I know it is the 303 delisting process, and I know it is this section, and then furthermore refinement, I know I want to give this data to Jim Smith, who runs the entire 303 delisting process for the health department. My point is this, is the more specific you get, if you can go knock on that person's door and know their name, the more you're going to understand their information needs, the more you can actually collect data that fit those information needs, the more your data will get used, and the more you'll have something to measure. So this piece of identifying who your users are is really, really important. And we're going to further on today here do a little exercise on identifying how do you actually get their information needs. So what you can begin to do now is the next step. Are we okay on the audio, Adam? I see someone's not hearing me. Double check on that. Okay. Is you're going to begin to now look for all unique combinations of users and uses. So back on this matrix of what you see on the screen here, I've illustrated 2 different unique types. Both of them fall under condition and trend and education. But what I would generate for teachers and students in terms of data information in this example is really different than what I might generate for farmers whom I might be asking to do a real specific best management practice. So I want you to play with that for a minute and begin to fill in your matrix. Again, this is sort of this lens through information needs. In this case, in this example, there's actually two different unique combinations of the study purpose and a data user. Unique combinations meaning they're going to need something different down there at the end of the line. So play with that for a minute. And if you can, fill out your matrix. Like some people usually ask me to do this first. So I'm going to give you an example of that from my program here that I started about 25 years ago. We have a volunteer monitoring program here in Colorado. It's statewide. And for those volunteers, it's mostly teachers and students. We're doing it for education and stewardship. And we do baseline monitoring, so it's condition and trend. But that data also goes to the health department, which is the Clean Water, the agency in Colorado that implements the Clean Water Act is the health department here. And they use it in their 303D and their 305B reporting. They use it for implementation of the Clean Water Act. We also give the data to local watershed groups to do local watershed planning. So same purpose, condition and trend, three different unique combinations of user and users. So I have three different assessment types here. We call them assessment types when you A1 or A2. Then we also, some of our groups are doing impact investigation. They actually use that data to investigate an impact. Some of those are volunteers. Some of those are the Department of Health when we give our data to the non-point source program, which is all about impact investigation as well as effectiveness monitoring. And then because we're using this data in the Clean Water Act, we are doing Clean Water Act use assessment. But what we communicate to the volunteers about that is really different than what we communicate with these other user groups. So if those examples help you, go for it. If they don't, what I'm asking you to do is to fill out your unique combinations of users and uses. Again, just play with it. See if you can do that, of who you would target or who you are already targeting.
Barb, you still on the line?
I am. I'm just letting people do this. I'm reading Bob's question. So Bob, you had a question about the slides give you examples that you find helpful. I believe the slides will be available, right, Adam?
Yes, we can post the slides, and we're going to post a recording of this webinar.
And in addition, Bob, when Adam sent you the link to this was another handout that is an example of my program here with answers to all of the steps actually of the entire workbook in a very abbreviated way. But you'll find in examples of these matrix filled out for my program, so you have that already. So hopefully that will help. So again, this isn't designed time-wise to allow you to finish all of this, but what I really want you to get out of this is, first of all, you're identifying who you're targeting. If you can't identify who you're targeting, you're in trouble for measurable results. When you begin, this ends up being a very juicy conversation for some organizations because sometimes the staff thinks they're targeting certain groups where the board thinks it's somebody else or the constituency. You can get some alignment within your organization around this conversation. And then it also brings up the gaps in who you really know and who you don't know and who you might need to take time to get to know in order to really get to effective, measurable results. And sometimes, I just say this, sometimes you just need people to retire if you've tried to make a relationship and you know the culture isn't right in the environment. That's really all I can say about it in the time we have. But let's see here. The point is, too, I want you to get that this conversation we're having here is about information needs and how still really different that is than measuring how many stations you monitor, how many indicators, how many river miles. It's a very different kind of measurable results. I'm hoping you're getting a flavor for that. So why would you even do this? Why would you take the time to do this? Well, first of all, if you're just starting a program, why would you not? Because you're going to waste money if you don't. But if you have a program and you've never really done this, it can seem laborious at the upfront. But you really almost need to do it one time before it becomes kind of culturally, it becomes the way you think. And then the amount of time you need to spend on it maybe not as much. But I would encourage everybody to document this. Document what you do so that when you do move on, that's the legacy that you're leaving the people behind you. And a lot of our organizations have a high turnover. You're helping them not start from scratch and actually move what you started forward. So I'm a huge fan of documentation. But what I have witnessed this do, this kind of effort, is you as a group gives you the ability to communicate what you're doing and what you're not doing. I get accused of my data from our program not being valid for this and that reason. And it's so easy for me to show people and show entities, you're right, because that's not what we're doing. We're not collecting things for the 1,000 significant digits, so we don't need to be doing those protocols. Here's what we are doing, and here's what we're generating, and here's why our data is good against this question. So it's really, really good, and it defines our niche in the world. We have situations in Colorado where everybody and their mother is sampling a particular river. You kind of question if there's any water left in the river. But at the end of the day, I can communicate what we're doing that nobody else is doing, and so we have a valid seat at the table. We're not duplicating because here's our niche. So it helps you find that overlap and duplicity within your own program and the value of each station and indicator, and I'm going to show you how that plays out in a minute. It can help you prioritize the uses of your information and who you target and your resources. It helps you understand what you're producing as in terms of information, not just data. So it helps you get closer at languaging and storytelling your outcomes versus your outputs. It helps you evolve. You go from one set of monitoring questions, you get data, and now you can evolve into the next set of questions and tell that story. That's a measurable progress. It gives your organization and your program credibility, transparency, and reproducibility if you can do this. And it actually makes your monitoring program or information system cost effective. So that's all listed on page 9 of your workbook. So once you've sort of done this and you have your matrix filled out, the next question is, how do you really get information? How do you understand the information needs of the user? Now, there's 1,000 ways to do that. Some of them are no-brainer and informal, like go and ask. But because this is a workbook designed to meet anybody where they are, we have some worksheets to kind of get at it. So I would invite you to look at these particular worksheets and look at things that you've never asked before or that you've never thought about asking if you're starting a program. And so this is kind of an overview of what you would do in this workbook. You're getting at what decision they're going to make, and that may mean starting a relationship. But it's not just what they need, like they need dissolved oxygen. You might find out they need other data like temperature or metadata, or they need some of your quality assurance and control data. When do they need the information? What format do they need it in? How do they need it delivered? Do your users have the same monitoring questions that you have? That might be a difference in why your data is not being used there. And you might find they know the answer to that. They don't know, or they won't tell you. But at least you know that if you ask that, where your gap might be. And then you might find this overlap in duplicity in stations. So let's try this exercise. If you go to your page 11 of your worksheet, is an information need worksheet. And at the top of it, you can write down your assessment type, what your user, the unique use and user decision is, and maybe what monitoring question you're filling this out for. And if you just look down these series of questions, you're asking from this particular specific decision maker, what decision are you asking them to make? What key processes, natural and political, do they need to consider that maybe you don't need to consider? Like if it's a Clean Water Act process, there's a certain time of year that they might be taking data to assess your or answer your question. Maybe it's an election year. Maybe a county commissioner is getting voted in or out, or maybe there's maybe it was an anniversary of an event like Katrina that has political ramifications for the questions you're answering. These are real things to decision makers, and you want to incorporate that into your design if necessary. Then you kind of get into these what's, and over here on this particular slide, it tells you what phase in the Monitoring Design Framework workbook that you would answer these questions. What key indicators do they need, in what media, where do they need it, what are the benchmarks are they going to use to assess. Sometimes you need information about the benchmarks you need to be collecting, the frequency, duration, how good does the data need to be. You can read the rest of these. Some key decisions down here, when is the decision made? If you don't know when they're going to make it, and even if they don't know when they're going to make it, how are you going to follow it to know when it was made, to tell your story, to tell your measurable results? So I want you to just take a minute and pick one of your decision makers and try to answer that on page 11. Try to answer some of those questions and see how easy or hard it is. You can kind of get the flavor of if you have a relationship with a particular decision maker, it might be easier to find the answers to these. And there's more questions than I have up here on the slide on that particular handout. So I'm going to give you a minute to just look at that. You're answering these questions from their perspective, not yours. I hope you're getting some ahas in doing this on how it might be relevant to where you're at and what you need. I hope you're getting at a high level that all data users are not equal. And therefore, the delivery of what you produce to them is what you're measuring as a measurable result has got to be considered in the design. This next slide is on your workbook on page 12, and is an example of these exit points when you're delivering information. Does your data user want raw data? When I give my RiverWatch data to our health department, they don't want it analyzed. They want it raw because they combine it with everybody else's data and do their own analysis. But when we give our data to our watershed groups, we actually conduct an analysis. We do an interpretation. We stop at recommendations, but we just do a scientific interpretation. So we give them some summarized data. Your monitoring program might be you're actually providing some recommendations for a stakeholder group. These are very different information products, and they require an information plan from the raw data, and you want to have this in your monitoring design. This is a chunk of what you're measuring. When the raw data goes to the health department every year for us, and they incorporate it in their assessment of the Clean Water Act, that's a measurable result story. When they change a standard or upgrade a standard or change a use on it from our data, that's a measurable result. And I can tell that story very easily. This then always lends to the next issue around the ugly topic of data management. There's an entire section in the workbook, and this is often where people like to spend a lot of time when I teach the class live, is on data management. And so what you want to create is a data management plan that literally takes your data, if you look on your workbook page 13, from literally the moment it is generated to it's all the way to it's delivered to the decision maker. What is the pathway and the systems you need to have in place? Hardware, software, validation, copying, backups, naming conventions, all of those things that you need to have in place to get your data from being born, if you will, to dying when it's actually been used in a situation. What you're looking at on the screen is an example of a roadmap I gave a database builder of all the different things we generate. We generate metadata, field data, nutrient data, metals data, bug data, phys-hab data, and how it individually gets into our database and comes out as an output. For example, our field data, our volunteers enter on our website. But our bug data, we get an Excel sheet from the taxonomist. We scan in the example where they draw, and we enter that, by hand. So I can map out how all of this data ends up getting into raw data dumps or in reports. And that's what I encourage you to do and to document. It also helps you justify when you go back to your supervisor or whoever and say, I need an upgrade in this hardware and this software. We need this. This is management of your raw data right here. So that's what this slide is a spaceholder for, is to have that. So now you're on page 14 of the workbook. And in essence, step 6 is you would repeat this for all of your monitoring purposes, this exercise of identifying all your users and their information needs, and then relating that back to actual systems you have in place to generate that information, to deliver it, to send the raw data file off or write the report and put it on your website, et cetera, et cetera. In your workbook, you have this slide that looks very ominous, but it really isn't. The purpose of this slide is to show you how what we just did, which was figure out a monitoring use, monitoring questions, who are the decision makers, and what's the information, this sort of people design. The purpose is to illustrate how that informs the technical, the what we do, how we generate information in an evaluation of it. And I want you to notice here that I'm just going to highlight a few things here, that this is the same monitoring assessment type. It's condition trend, but for health department, condition trend for local groups, condition trend for volunteers. And where you see the difference is how I manage the data for their different uses. Our data goes to storage for the health department. Our data goes into, it's very specific. based on individual needs for the local group. And we make these little mini special watershed reports for volunteers that are just designed for that audience. And you can go over here on the raw data and see how that affects our information delivery. So I'm not saying you could use this mapping out visual. You have a blank worksheet in the workbook to do that, but that's just to show you how it's connected. The last thing I wanted to give you was a tool that when you do this exercise, if you do that, you generate a lot of information. You have these lists of questions and these lists of users and these lists of purposes and these lists of information needs, and it can be like, all right, now what do I do with this? How do I put this back together in something that is useful? So it's just a tool, but step 7 in the workbook has this sort of fact sheet we call an information blueprint that if you were to answer all the questions on, and you can look at it on page 17 and 18 of your workbook, it would summarize all this information into a blueprint or a FAQ, a frequently asked question maybe. Page 17 of your workbook shows what phase you answer these questions in, and then page 18 is an actual worksheet per monitoring question. And if you take a peek at it, I'm going to highlight some interesting questions, but like this first question is, how is this monitoring question and this assessment type related to my vision for the watershed of my organization or organizational outcomes? It's connecting this specific monitoring plan you have to your organization's needs. How does it relate to what exists out in the watershed already? These are all phase 1 things. Who am I targeting with this monitoring question? What when am I generating? What's the quality of the data I need to generate to satisfy these decision makers? How am I going to generate information? What are the benchmarks I'm going to use? Most people never do this. I hardly ever see this in any communication. Your monitoring question, which, okay, again, is at the top here. What's your monitoring question right here? This fact sheet says the monitoring question is met when I'm asking you to answer this ambiguous question so you can track your evolution of answering it. That's a measurable result. You can put down here, what are your products of monitoring? And this is where you can put your bean counting things. When are you going to evaluate this question? What are the assumption and external factors, like that this grant stays funded, that all the assumptions you have going into this? It tells the user who reads this the container that your monitoring question and program is in. And you're telling them what you're doing and not doing by putting that information out there. Here is where you have the opportunity to share what your definition of health is, or restore, or any ambiguous terms that are associated with your program. And then if you want, you can take this out, but this also gives you a budget. What is it going to cost to answer that question? And there's people probably that you work with that care about that particular item. So we don't have time today to fill this out, but you could create one of these for every monitoring question that you have, and it becomes a fact sheet that tells whoever you need to tell and communicate what you're doing and what you're not doing. There's probably other ways to do that. So we just really finished kind of playing with this identifying information needs of target. That's the second learning objective we had. And this is jumping into then the last objective of when you do this work, when you take the time to do this, step 8 here, step 8 is then you can do what I'm about to show you. You can start to make these correlations. So we just spent the bulk of our time on these steps here. I'm tapping into some of the tools and worksheets that are now in step 17 on evaluation. So for all of these charts I'm showing you now are on page 20, and they're just examples to show you what you end up being able to communicate. So here, this particular chart is a list of all the stations in a program, and they're identifying which specific assessment type, which again is a combination of a use and a user, that they apply to. So what if funder X or the board comes in and says, well, we're not going to do that education program anymore. So therefore, we're going to take away your money to monitor the Blue River. You can come back and say, wait a minute, that Blue River station here, here, and here are also associated with these purposes and uses. So if you cut that program, we're still keeping them for this. I mean, this is what you can begin to do, which I think is valuable for most people. This is the same kind of story you can tell, only it's by indicator. You come in, and again, they cut some program, or they want to take your your particular meter away. You're like, well, wait a minute, that's going to affect all of these studies. The same kind of story here, only this is information products. What each of these purposes and assessment types you have here go into these organizational, perhaps, information products that you can then organize your people around. This is another one on different benchmarks that you might have. What particular work you're doing are using specific benchmarks. And finally, this last one is like a summary of all your assessment types, data sources. You can use this exact framework to analyze other people's data for your purposes. In fact, you ought to be doing that and understanding why they generated it. So this is data that you collected, us, or somebody else gave you, the particular purpose, the particular user, and the question associated with it. It's just a summary of that information. And at the end of the day, I've used this over and over in my program. This is the classic cog and wheel illustration that shows, you all live this, I believe, in your particular watershed. Maybe this circle here represents the health department. This is the USGS. This is the nonprofit up the road. And you could have 15 circles here. And nobody knows where there's overlap, where there's duplication, where there's actually important niches to retain. And if everybody was able to communicate some of the things that we're doing here and work together, you now have the axiom, and maybe this axiom here, the cog here, is a healthy functioning watershed. And I can tell you that the USGS's role in keeping that is XYZ. This is maybe the BLM, maybe this is the health department, maybe this is you. But everyone can figure out where they are on that cog and wheel, and they're working together instead of this sort of disparate. Sometimes you need to have this disparity over here if there's trust issues. But this is ideally where we go to leverage, truly leverage our resources. It's just an illustration of that kind of concept. Another way to illustrate what you're doing, and this is all on a worksheet in phase 1, is the logic model. Most of us don't think about using the logic model to illustrate and communicate our monitoring program. But it does help you distinguish between your outputs, which is your beans, how many stations, how many indicators, how many miles, from your outcomes and your impact. This is your measurable result, folks, when you have that information design figured out. And then it's connected to the inputs, the money and the time and the relationships and the assumptions that go into generating both outputs and outcomes. So the logic model can be very helpful. So a lot of information today, a lot of worksheets for you to think on and reflect on. Hopefully you got something light out of today that will direct you, whether it's to continue on in the advanced class. I hope you got something out of why you are or are not creating a measurable result, or how you possibly could begin to if you're starting a program. And I really appreciate your attention and willingness to participate in this. Just a little brief mention on what is this fall more in-depth class about. I mean, can you really do this? Can you really produce a usable monitoring design that measures results? Part of what you create in this class is the standard operation procedure, these sub-documents, a quality assurance plan, a data management plan. Yes, you can really do all of this, and you can get money back too. The way we're organizing this, there's more information on a website we'll give you here, but It's over 5 months. It meets every other week. We are requiring that you attend all or none of the sessions because we are really trying to produce something. So it doesn't work if people are try to come in on the third class. We'll already be writing your monitoring plan. One of the cool things I like about what we proposed here is that you can have more than one person attend. So when you need your technical guy, your board member, your funder to work on a particular set of questions you're answering, you can have them sit in on this. It's not a one person. You're going to be using your own circumstance and situation, so this is absolutely catered to your situation. If you actually produce a plan at the end of this, you get a $500 rebate back. They're 2-hour webinars, and the next day I'm open for office hours, so you get that one-on-one. And over the course of the 5 months, I'm giving you 2 hours of private consultation with myself. There'll be a pre-evaluation you fill out, so we can even cater the class to those who sign up. And there's some details on when the registration closes. You're getting so much more, and if you produce a plan, you know, this is only costing you about $700, which is amazing. So I'm going to thank you here briefly, and there's going to be a survey that's coming your way. Thank you very much for showing up, and more important, thank you for all the work that you all do in each and every one of your watersheds. After living through the Anima situation here, I'm even more aware of and grateful that there's so many of you out there doing great work. And I really, really hope that I can continue our relationship and help you in any way that I can. If you have any questions about the content of this webinar, feel free to call me, email me. Any questions about the upcoming class, the recording, Adam is at your beck and call. And on the slide there is the link to the River Network website that has all the detail on the fall class. And so I think with that, Adam, if people have any questions to type in or want to make a comment, it'd be great if you got something out of this, if you learned anything, if you would maybe raise your hand at a minimum. That would help us see that there isn't a bunch of strangers out there, and there actually was something gained out of this. That would be great, because I love seeing your faces, and I didn't get to see them.
Well, thank you so much, Barb. That was fantastic. I echo her sentiments. Hope everyone found today's intro session very useful, and that they found that the complete series will have even more information that would be useful to your monitoring program. Again, if anyone has any questions about the series, they can direct those to Barb or myself. And I will be sure to make sure that the recording and the slides of today's webinar be posted to the River Network website. They'll be on the same page that describes the series, and you can find that by going to the webinar link under resources on the River Network homepage. So, Barb, any final comments?
No, just thanks again, and go kick monitoring measurable result butt.